Most people think a PIP begins with paperwork, but it usually starts weeks earlier, when your future quietly changes. By the time HR schedules that meeting, they are not investigating you, they are usually managing risk already attached. That is why the conversation feels so cold, so rehearsed and strangely final, even when they call it support. You think the company is opening a process, but often it is closing one, and documenting the closure carefully. Here is what actually happens. Before a PIP reaches your inbox, a private story about you has usually hardened. Not just about performance either, about trust, promotability, political fit, manager confidence, and whether defending you still feels expensive. This is the part nobody warns you about. PIPs often formalize a decision long before they genuinely test improvement. That does not mean every PIP is fake, but it does mean the real decision window often closes earlier. If you miss that window, nothing about the document will make sense because the visible process hides invisible conclusions. You will stare at vague phrases like ownership, urgency, communication, alignment, and consistency, wondering why none were urgent before. Because those words are not just feedback anymore. They are legal safe packaging for decisions already becoming organizational consensus. When HR enters, they are not discovering facts from scratch. They are assessing whether the company can defend them. And that changes everything, because your manager may be emotional, but HR is measuring exposure, precedent, paperwork, and consistency. They want to know whether expectations were stated, whether examples exist, whether employees were treated similarly, and who approved. If those pieces are in place, your PIP stops being a coaching tool and becomes a controlled organizational procedure. The shock comes from timing. You are reacting to the first visible sign, while everyone else is reacting later. That is why your boss suddenly sounds patient in meetings after weeks of irritation, because escalation already moved elsewhere. They are no longer trying to change you in real time. They are trying to create a usable record. Notice the shift when feedback becomes strangely generic, deadlines become surprisingly documented, and small mistakes start appearing in writing. That is not random professionalism. It is often the transition from management frustration into institutional memory for future decisions. Once that happens, everything you say gets filtered differently, especially pushback, emotion, context, or attempts to explain complexity fully. What sounds reasonable to you can sound offensive to HR because they are evaluating risk signals, not emotional fairness. That is why high performers get blindsided. They confuse output with protection when organizations often prioritize predictability over value. If you are brilliant but difficult to narrate upward, your achievements may not save you when the climate changes. And climate matters more than people admit. A new leader arrives, margins tighten, layoffs whisper, and suddenly tolerance shrinks. The same behavior called entrepreneurial last year becomes sloppy execution this year because the company needs a different story. Here is the quiet part. HR usually knows whether your manager wants rehabilitation, containment, or a legally cleaner exit. Those are completely different realities, and employees rarely understand which one they are standing inside until it hurts professionally. If the real goal is rehabilitation, the signals look specific, timely, uncomfortable, and connected to behaviors you can change. If the goal is exit, the signals look broader, vaguer, and strangely detached from the work you thought mattered. Maybe sales numbers are fine, but now it is about tone, collaboration, communication style, or executive confidence in you. Maybe projects ship on time, but suddenly the concern is leadership presence, stakeholder management, or how others experience you. Those phrases matter because they are harder to disprove, easier to personalize, and more flexible inside performance documentation systems. This is why employees leave those meetings confused instead of corrected, because confusion is a byproduct of political language. The deeper problem is that once your name enters negative narrative, neutral events stop being interpreted neutrally anymore. A missed Slack reply is not a missed Slack reply anymore. It becomes another example of unreliable communication patterns. A tense meeting is not a tense meeting. It becomes evidence that you resist feedback or destabilize the team. A reasonable boundary about workload can be reframed as inflexibility, especially if leadership already questions your long-term fit. And once examples start accumulating under that frame, HR does not need dramatic failure. They need consistent narratable concern. That is why smart employees feel crazy during this stage, because the facts they see no longer match outcomes. You are still arguing about accuracy while the system is arguing about manageability, optics, future risk, and organizational comfort. Here is what HR already knows before the PIP lands: whether influential people still want to spend political capital. That phrase matters because careers are not only built on talent, they are built on who keeps advocating publicly. If your manager has stopped defending you in calibration meetings, succession discussions, or skip-level conversations, the odds collapse. And you do not hear that moment happened. You only feel its consequences later through colder treatment and vaguer feedback. Maybe your boss stops bringing your name into strategic projects. Maybe they stop correcting others when someone questions you. Maybe they become weirdly formal over email, or start copying HR, or ask for weekly updates they never needed. This is not always malice. Sometimes it is fear, because managers protect themselves when employee situations start feeling litigable. In large American companies, nobody wants to own a messy personnel problem without a trail, especially during reorgs and layoffs. So documentation expands, witnesses multiply, and ordinary management language gets replaced by phrases designed to survive scrutiny from leadership later. That is why a PIP can feel eerily disconnected from your lived experience. It was drafted for other audiences, not just you and not just your manager. It was written for HR, leadership, and maybe future legal review. Once you see that, the emotional shock starts making sense because the document was never designed to feel human. It was designed to appear reasonable, consistent, progressive, and fair enough that decision makers can later point toward it. What makes this worse is that many employees respond exactly how a failing narrative predicts they will respond next. They panic, over-explain, vent to coworkers, send emotional late-night emails, or challenge wording instead of strategy first. From their perspective, that reaction is understandable. From the system's perspective, it often becomes fresh confirmation of existing concerns. Here is the brutal reality. Once the story hardens, your behavior stops creating meaning and starts getting assigned meaning. That is why the smartest move is not emotional persuasion. It is evidence, discipline, precision, and controlled visibility everywhere. If you are on the edge of a PIP, or already inside one, stop trying to be understood first. Start by mapping the actual situation. Who wants you gone? Who is undecided? Who still benefits from protecting you? That sounds cynical, but it is accurate. Workplace outcomes often follow sponsorship patterns more than formal value statements displayed. Then look at the document like an external investigator would, not like a wounded employee seeking moral relief instead. Which claims are subjective, which are measurable, which dates matter, and which supposed expectations were never clearly stated anywhere. What can be disproved? What can only be contextualized? And what should be answered with boring documented consistency every time? Because boring wins here. Drama feeds narratives, but clean documentation can interrupt them, or at least narrow the damage. This is the part nobody likes. Sometimes the best response to a PIP is preparing to leave strategically early. Not because you are defeated, but because organizations sometimes use improvement plans to choreograph exits with minimal friction internally. If trust is already gone above your manager, no amount of perfect weekly updates may reverse the larger decision. And that is not your personal failure. It is what institutions do when they need smoother explanations than conflict. But sometimes the PIP is survivable, and the difference usually appears in the behavior surrounding the document itself. If leaders keep giving access, answer questions directly, and specify what success looks like, there may be a path. If they withhold context, move goalposts, delay feedback, and act irritated by your attempts to improve, read that carefully. Read it as information, not emotion, because systems reveal intentions through patterns long before anyone states them plainly aloud. Another thing HR often knows before the PIP begins is whether your role itself is becoming less safe overall. Sometimes your performance issue is partly real, but the urgency around it comes from budget pressure or restructuring higher up. When headcount targets appear, companies start sorting people into defendable, movable, regrettable, and expendable categories without saying so openly. A PIP can become the administrative bridge between financial pressure and a story that sounds merit-based to executives. That is why timing matters so much. If the company is reorganizing, your narrative may be doing double duty. It explains why perfectly fixable problems suddenly receive formal treatment, while worse behavior elsewhere keeps getting informal forgiveness instead. The process feels personal because it touches your livelihood, identity, and reputation, but the machinery is often impersonal underneath. And that is strangely useful, because once you stop expecting fairness, you can finally start reading incentives clearly now. Who needs clean records? Who needs a scapegoat? Who needs headcount savings? And who simply wants silence around them? When you can answer those questions, the PIP stops feeling mystical and starts looking like an organizational weather report. Here is the final shift. Your goal is not proving you are good, because that was never enough anymore. Your goal is discovering whether the system still has a place for you and acting before it closes completely. If it does, respond like a professional auditor, not a bruised soul. Concise facts, calm tone, visible execution daily. If it does not, protect your references, preserve your energy, document everything, and plan your next move quietly now. Because the worst mistake is begging an organization to restore meaning after it has already reassigned your meaning internally. Once that happens, effort alone becomes theater. You may still be performing, but the audience has changed already upstairs. And when the audience changes, success is no longer about improvement. It is about whether anyone believes improvement matters. That is what HR often knows first and why the meeting feels chilling. They are reacting to downstream realities. You are meeting the official process, but they are living in the consequences that process was built to manage. So if a PIP appears, do not only ask whether you can improve, ask what decision it is serving. Because once you see the decision underneath the document, the fear changes shape, and strategy becomes possible again immediately. The hardest truth in corporate life is simple. By the time paperwork starts, you are no longer being judged.